Hey there guys, it's been a while since I've recorded anything, and that's probably gonna continue in the form of essays or video responses, as I'm feeling really burnt out because, as it turns out, weeks worth of deep introspection on the existential nature of how people conceptualize information, philosophies, and or political affiliations, along with how that informs their conclusions and abilities to even come to said conclusions for multiple videos, which themselves take a full day to edit and record, can be pretty debilitating. And when I do return, expect me to make videos on Marxism or progressives, as it's been a while since the last time I really did a response to either of those two subjects. And as much as I love shitting on so-called minarchists and populists, it gets tiring after a while to talk about them. Anyway, so there has been no end to the amount of coverage our favorite pretend Mexican, Beto O'Rourke's statement during the third Democratic Party debate regarding gun confiscation has received, which I'm not going to cover because his points and his position have been widely rebutted to where even other politicians who appeal to the same material interest as Beto are uncomfortable citing and commenting on his statements at this point. I made this video because Beto in the last month has been saying things which are far more absurd, which have hardly seen any coverage, and delve deeper into the gun debate in a far more interesting way, which is usual than what is usually covered in mainstream media. Anyway, this first clip here is from a rally in Aurora, Colorado.
My name is and I drove down here from Rifle, Colorado to speak with you today. I was one of the gun-owning Americans that heard your speech and heard what you had to say regarding hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15s and your AR. And
Let's be respectful. Let's be respectful.
Well, I am here to say hell no, you're not. So with that, I would like to know how you intend to legislate evil. Because it is not the gun, it is the heart of the man that does that. We all have stories. Excuse me.
Let's allow her to finish, please.
We can all have these stories. We all have the experiences. I was living in Aurora during Columbine. I had just recently moved when the Aurora shootings happened, yet I have very close ties here. Yet all of those people were there defenseless. They had no way to defend themselves against a crazed shooter. So I want to know how you intend to legislate the hearts of men and leave American citizens like myself, American mothers. I have 4 children. I'm 5'0", 100 pounds. Cannot really defend myself with a fist.
It's okay. Please let's allow her to finish.
I don't have my AR-15 today. I have my Glock. Well, you shouldn't have it. Don't worry, sir. I have your back. Anyway. I want to know how you're going to legislate that, because a criminal, by defense, breaks the law. So all you're going to do is restrict law-abiding citizens like myself. We all know that you, sir, have a criminal history, and I understand that burglars do not like armed defense.
It's okay.
Yes, sir. Burglars do not like armed defense, yet that is a right that we have that shall not be infringed in America.
Okay, I really appreciate the question. And the presumption, and this, can we get the microphone on a different channel because it keeps cutting out? There's this presumption that we are just, I guess, inherently evil. Because you ask, how are we going to legislate this? And the 40,000 gun deaths in America, just must be something wrong with us. Or gets back to this idea that I began my comments with, is this just our fate?
Wow. You know, it's stuff like this which really amuses me to think that a regularly attempted rebuttal to libertarian positions provided by politicians, their media personalities, and statists is that libertarianism is unrealistic or relies on an overly charitable view of human action and requires people to be entirely benevolent to have a functional society conceptually without a state. Because when you really get down to the structural premises behind the worldview which presumes political rule to be anything other than self-interested, and that political rule can be legitimate itself, to say that these arguments are conceptually detached from any semblance of tangible observation is an understatement, and many of these arguments in favor of the state fundamentally rely on the implication that there exists human action which isn't self-motivated or in some way through the use of violence imposed onto society via the government, that people will somehow just become benevolent and begin to have their interests met somehow. Yeah, even when I was a statist, it didn't really make sense to believe that a central monopoly on arbitration, which has structural incentives to antagonize the interests of the people it claims to rule over and requires coercion to exist, which creates artificial scarcity, and consequently leads to an objective and demonstrable decline in living conditions along with economic opportunities through the artificial scarcity it creates and the industries it cartelizes, can somehow function in the interests of the population it claims to rule over. And how the concept of a collective interest can even make sense to begin with, given that interests are marginal traits based on individual conceptions of their own material preferences and how they process information through their own relative view of the world. But here you have Beto in response to someone confronting him about the fact that using force to ban the legal trade of guns, as he proposed, turns people looking to defend themselves into criminals within the state's socio-political order, because they will be treated as criminals for defending themselves against actual criminals if they obtain a gun and use it potentially against an aggressor. In typical politician cheese tactics, he dodges the question entirely by using vague rhetoric, which sounds as if it carries explanatory power, but intellectually amounts to nothing, as it establishes no counter-argument or cohesive truth claim, and is mainly designed to be up for interpretation so that people end up projecting their own meanings of what the politician in question means, which is beneficial to their own interests. But his rhetoric here does seem to carry a discernible implication, which is that if the government used violence to suppress the trade of guns within its political legal market framework, that people would just magically be less violent. Which, fucking woo lad. That's a hot take I don't think I even need to comment on, but needless to say, this argument is contradicted by observation in that in other state societies where the government has a more monopolistic stance over the legal ownership of firearms, crime rates tend to be significantly higher per capita than, in fact, areas within the U.S. itself, which have more local monopolistic legal fiat in relation to the legal trade of firearms. Those areas, such as Chicago, for instance, tend to have higher crime rates than areas where there's more legal gun ownership. And it can be reasoned fairly easily that within most conceptual frameworks, people not being able to legally defend themselves only incentivizes crime by lowering risk associated with aggressive actions. But the main point here, though, being that something you hear a lot from people like Beto in defense of positions like this are these empty appeals to pragmatism, or positions which they frame as being pragmatic, which they can't even really consistently argue due to their position as an argument for political rule being inherently rooted in materialism, and as such being incapable of establishing a cohesive truth claim in the first place. But here, his only argument against what is a position which barely scrapes the surface of problems with gun control arguments is more or less just, well, people are inherently good and benevolent, and America without guns would just be a magical land where the rivers are made of chocolate and that the children will play and laugh with gumdrop smiles. Like, a lot of these arguments from the statist perspective for political rule and the premises which make them up are remarkably out of touch, but this is hardly the main clip I wanted to focus on here today. This clip is what I was mainly interested in talking about here, and this is the sort of argumentation and framing which turns people into anarchists overnight. So let's just go ahead and play it, because this needs to be seen to be believed. This isn't the original clip. I can't really find the original clip, but this is from some town hall event, and a radio host, Evan McDonald from Commando Radio, went to ask Beto about the Second Amendment, or gun rights, in its application to whether or not people would be able to fight against a tyrannical government.
Amendment as being a check and balance of the public to have equal power to the people that serve us and not rule us. What does it say about you as a leader for wanting to tip the scales of that balance severely in the favor of public servants?
Yep. For those who wonder, what is the counter argument to the one that I've made? That Americans shouldn't have weapons designed for war, that can, in under 40 seconds, kill 10 people. Here in your community, in under 3 minutes, kill 22.
Robert?
One of the best arguments that I think I've heard is that the Second Amendment is intended to ensure that the American public, if they need to, can provide a check, a violent check on their government, a tyrannical administration. People can rise up militarily against their government. We hear about a well-regulated militia.
What
happens coincidentally? I'm reading a book called Trail of Tears about the history of the Cherokee Nation. And the book starts out in the late 18th century, and there are these militias that are responding to attacks by Cherokees and Creeks, and there are these militias who themselves are going on the offense and attacking Native American communities. It is incredibly bloody, but that is a militia at that time defending or going on the offense for a given community.
And guess
we settled this question about whether we should be able to rise up against our government in 1865 in a courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. Right now, if you wanted to arm yourself sufficient to take on a government that spends $750 billion a year on its military, which is larger than the 10 largest military budgets combined that follow ours, we're going to need more than an AR-15. We're going to need some aircraft carriers, some nuclear submarines.
Robert?
Amendment, that's your interpretation of it. The consequence of that is that we now have military-grade weapons, more than 10 million of them, in the hands of our fellow Americans, not latently waiting for use against the government, being actively used against us in our communities, in our churches, in synagogues, out on a Saturday night partying and having fun in downtown Dayton or at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. And so I want to make sure that we protect your right to use a firearm to hunt or to defend yourself in your home. But if it is a right to be able to rise up or stand against your government, I don't accept that. That's not my reading of the Constitution.
Yeah, so Beto's point about people being incapable of forcibly resisting government tyranny has been rebutted ad nauseum. We have plenty of examples historically of armed populations being the specifically cited strategic reason as to why invading states militarily chose not to invade a specific area in question, examples of which being Rajneeshpuram and the American National Guard, the Japanese military in the United States homeland, Switzerland during the Third Reich, and arguably today, given that it's basically the only major country in South Central Europe which isn't being occupied by the European Union, and it's been long noted by legal philosophers from empiricists such as David Hume to the more conventional libertarian theorists such as Lysander Spooner or Murray Rothbard, that governments using force alone cannot maintain a cohesive political rule because they are overwhelmingly outnumbered in resources and number by the population they claim to rule over. Governments need to also go about trying to convince the population that political rule exists to serve their interests, and the state goes about doing this in various ways, most notably, as I've pointed out, hegemonic master narratives propagated through state media and the government's compulsory education, which are designed conceptually to retard the non-state population into seeing their material interests as being interchangeable with that of the states. Not to mention, you have to love how when proponents of gun monopolization actually do make an attempt to engage in what could generously be referred to as an intellectual discussion, you get situations like this, where Beto uses examples of government tyranny as an example of how the non-state population being armed formed a militia and was being repressive towards another population, even though that was the state that did that, which doesn't even conceptually make any sense for reasons previously noted, on top of being provably wrong historically. Examples of gun confiscation are almost immediately followed by financial collapse or some sort of large-scale atrocity, always. Basically, the state knows that it's about to have to do something which isn't going to go well with its legal socio-political framework and the narratives they've constructed, and want to make sure that as many of the people as possible whom they've subjugated don't have a means of fighting them once they do finally internalize how badly they're getting fucked over by the state. In fact, governments have manufactured entirely new, crude, disposable models of guns throughout history, specifically with the intention of having their intelligence agencies distribute them to the populations of societies who were being ruled by rival states during wars. This being done specifically with the expressed intention of invoking psychological warfare by making the rival states' legal order less stable and cohesive. For example, the FP-45 Liberator, which was manufactured by the U.S. government and distributed to dissident political movements within regions occupied by the Third Reich during World War II by the CIA. And I'll link the actual unclassified CIA documents relating to the creation of the FP-45, where the author of these papers proposing the strategy specifically cites how having a population whom the Nazis didn't know was armed was intended to serve the previously noted effect. So even governments, including the US government, historically have demonstrated an understanding of how an armed population can have subversive, destabilizing effects on a political rule, which has lost its ability to establish its cohesive master narrative, and have applied this understanding in tactical strategy. Now, I actually have quite a bit to critique regarding the framing of the argument put forth by Evan McDonald to Beto's position, his attempted rebuttal of it as well, particularly the intentions behind the Second Amendment, the idea that an armed population is innately subversive towards the interest of the state which rules over them, or that a population which practically since birth is systemically force-fed a bunch of propaganda that's designed to make them incapable of conceptual conceptualizing their interests as being separate from the political ruling class which subjugates them is even capable of revolting against the government on the grounds that the government would be violating their rights. Given that the default framework most people in such a society functions within would be a materialist one, which has no ability to establish a cohesive counter regarding the master narratives created by the state or to ethical dilemmas the state poses. And of course, that governments, being entities incapable of producing wealth, are dependent on cohesive appropriation of other people's property, and are a monopoly on arbitration, therefore requires tyranny to exist, so you can't really have a state which isn't tyrannical. But this is more of an essay subject due to how much there is to cover regarding that position. I indeed have been writing a script on and off since about mid-August about exactly this subject, so when I come back to putting out responses and essays consistently, this will probably be one of the first videos that I put out. The reason that I even bring it up at all, then, you might be asking, is because of the conclusion of Beto's statement that people don't have a right to defend themselves against government coercion after making the case that people shouldn't even try to because government's got too many guns. Which, the irony of the latter argument is fucking astounding, but I digress back to the former. He is effectively stating, and openly so, that criminals can't be held responsible for any crimes that they commit because nothing a group which refers to themselves as a government does is a crime, and people have no right to protect their own interests against such a group. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. This is a level of authoritarianism so open that I think he just broke Filthy's tyranny scale, because he's essentially arguing what all politicians secretly think, but for the most part downplay significantly in their messaging, which is that from his perspective, the government can't do anything wrong, and you have no right to protect your own interests, so you ought to just shut up and take whatever the government does. If that's not a direct deconstruction of the government's claim that it serves the interests of the people it claims to coercively rule over, beyond all the logical and demonstrable problems with that claim, I don't know what is. I don't even really have anything to say more about that. I mean, it's such a nonsensical, blatantly contradictory and inconsistent position, and it just sort of exposes statism to such an extent he really couldn't make the case about anything in relation to politics following this argument to its natural conclusion. And it's stuff like this that, like I said, is gonna probably end up turning people into anarchists. So, politics and late statism is interesting, to say the least. And I'm absolutely positive that it's not going to get any crazier from here. Wink, wink. By the way, this probably would have been done 3 days ago, but I made the unfortunate mistake of choosing a subject which I wasn't that interested in at the moment. I mean, gun control arguments have just been so thoroughly trashed. So it took me a bit to actually sit down, write, and record this, so hence why this is being uploaded on the 6th of October. But anyway, I guess that's all for today. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe. Make sure to turn on notifications and possibly even share the content this channel puts out, because we are being absolutely slaughtered in YouTube's algorithms. Anyway, I'll see you all next time.